you're trying to identify who are the movers and shakers within the organization, who is most respected, who can you go to in a pinch when something is broken. And this is where influencing without authority, like leadership without
Yeah.
authority, that's what we are. Technical program managers are leaders without any authority. Everywhere I've gone, the very first thing I do, my first 2 weeks, is just coffee chats with everybody. Or now it's like Zoom chats with everybody or meetup chats with
Yeah.
everybody. And I'm not asking them any sort of specific questions. It's just I want to know who you are. How long have you been here? What have you done? What makes you tick? Right? And then slowly and steadily, once I've built the people map, then I start building the tech stack map around those people to understand, because I think you have to realize it's that the tech stack is a representation of the people who work at that company, right?
Yeah. Today's guest is Aadil Maan, lead engineering program manager at Humane and big tech veteran, having been program manager at Apple, Google, Nike, and Blackberry. Aadil has incredible experience working on complex 0 to 1 products, combining hardware and software. So the theme of this chat is the World Builder Framework, Adil's own approach to problem solving and figuring out processes, frameworks, and workflows for product and engineering teams. Adil's framework builds upon the learned experience of shipping software and hardware at big tech and fast-paced startups and gives a new lens for leaders to solve problems instead of forcing rigid, off-the-shelf traditional methodologies. So let's dive into the chat after a short word from our sponsor. LinearB is the software engineering intelligence platform enabling engineering leaders to improve their team's operational efficiency and align R&D investments to business goals. Unlike other tools, LinearB goes beyond visibility to also build workflow automation that improves dev team performance. This results in the ability to automate the continuous improvement of engineering operations and translate R&D data into quantifiable business impact. With an engineering metrics program powered by LinearB, leaders improve resource allocation, align their goals to business needs, and get the reporting and dev coaching resources they need. Over 3,000 companies worldwide trust LinearB to continuously improve their software delivery operations and provide insight into the business impact of R&D investments. Get started for free today at linearb.io. Hey Adil, welcome.
Hey,
Thank you
Luca.
for being here with us today.
Am I your first repeat?
Yes, exactly. You're the first person that I have interviewed actually twice, first time on the podcast, and I'm so happy. I mean, you deserve it because the first chat that we had, I think it was maybe 1 year ago. It was amazing. Got such a great response from the newsletter readers. So I was really eager to have another chat.
I'm happy to be here, man. Thank you for having me.
So today we will talk about so many things because we may talk about technical program management. We will talk, of course, about the title track of today, which is your World Builders Framework. We may talk about planning and executing software and hardware projects. So let me start by saying that we can afford to cover all this ground because you have such an incredible experience. You have worked at so many years for big tech companies like Apple, Google, Nike, and more recently at Humane, where you have delivered the insane AI pin. And I want you to tell us more about this. I know it's kind of secretive, you can't say much, but I will try to extract some secret sauce from that.
This is turning into an interrogation.
Yes, exactly. You didn't know that coming into this, but it will turn into that. So let me start. I mean, it's with breaking the ice with a simple question. So, like last time, also, I would love to ask you more about what is, in your opinion, a technical program manager, and what is technical program management? Because many people are still confused by what this means. And if I can make even a step back, what is even a program? You know, we talk all the time about projects, products. Now we have all these words that start with pro, but they all mean different things. So give us your short definition about this role and this job.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's getting more and more muddier with the development that you have in generative AI. And then you start looking at what's happening at Airbnb,
Yeah,
where sort of what I call orchestrator roles are slowly being pushed back into their specialist spaces, right?
yeah,
The most recent kerfuffle was at, I think, Instagram, where they decided to get rid of all their technical program managers and tell them either you're PMs or you go find someplace else to work, right? And I
wow,
think
yeah,
that kind of thing everybody's exploring. So, for me, the question itself is getting very harder. And I think the right way to think about it is not so much what it is that we do as technical program managers, but the value that we bring. And when you start to look
yeah,
at that, then you start to see that at a certain point, there is an opportunity cost that organizations have to pay for engineering or PMs to continue to maintain the strategic execution part of their jobs.
yeah,
Everybody knows that PMs have to be thinking about what comes next on the roadmap. Engineers have to be focused on what they need to build. And at some point in the middle, things start to get disconnected. And the value of technical program managers is sort of that middle conduit that connects all these pieces together. Some would argue that a PM could do that role, and they for or an engineering manager could do that role, and I would be like, yeah, sure. But then you start to think about if an engineering manager has to go deal with an incident that occurs
yes,
because of some outage, versus driving an architectural conversation about the next set of features or functionalities they're building on a platform or service, versus figuring out, okay, there's somebody said something really great to me, one of my colleagues, of like, um, eating the vegetables. And for whether we like it or not, the technical program managers, even though programs in our title, there's a lot of vegetables that we have to eat, which includes,
mm.
if you're running Scrum, guiding those Scrum
Yeah,
methodology and processes, or backlog grooming, or figuring out the project plans of like, what are you doing in the next couple of months and weeks and things like that. And it becomes very slowly this onion that you start to peel
yeah,
apart. And then you start to realize that the opportunity cost is you drop other things to go focus on this connective piece, this strategic
yeah,
alignment that needs to happen. And then when you introduce business development into the concept, when you introduce product marketing into that concept, and when you include design into that concept, and very quickly you start to see that unless you're a very tiny team of one people each and you're all like very cohesively together, you need somebody who's keeping an eye on the 10,000-foot level as well
yeah,
as able to go to the 100-foot level to figure out what's going on. So
yeah,
I think TPMs in a nutshell are generalist specialists. We are specialists who are really great at doing a lot of much of everything.
yeah,
We are jack of all trades. We have to be. That's the nature of it. And it turns out that jack of all trades is actually not an insult. It's actually a compliment, because jack of all trades will always be better. Like if you read the whole quote, it's like jack of
yes,
all trades, master of none is still better than the one who specializes in one.
yes,
It,
yes,
it, it blew my mind. I was like, what the what? So that's what
yeah,
we are. We are a jack of all trades, that not just ensures that an organization is delivering across cross-functional programs, but in many ways we are also the the process and governance aspect of an organization
mm.
that's looking at how
Mm.
engineering teams can continue to operate at efficiency. What kind of improvements can we bring to the entire game of product development? And that's where, like, I'm slightly starting to touch on my world builder framework, because it's been something I've observed for quite a number of years, that I finally last year put it all together in some sort of a framework that people can understand. But yeah, that's what it does. That's what we do. We do everything.
That's very great definition. So basically, you're saying there's a tipping point where the opportunity cost for other roles, for let's say engineering managers or product managers, to deal with all these disconnected pieces gets too high with respect to having a specialized role that acts
Yep.
as a generalist, though, to bridge all these things together. So, a natural follow-up to this might be, when is it in your experience that you get to see this tipping point? Is it about the company scale, or about cross-functional lines of work, or product maturity? I mean, I'm thinking from a perspective of a CTO, or a director who's thinking, do I need a TPM for my team, for the work, for the problems we are solving, or not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one of those situations where you will see it, you will know it when you see it, right? You will
Yeah.
start to feel the pain. You will start to see obvious things that were not so obvious being dropped on the floor. Like, for
Mm.
example, you are building a feature and you're getting close to feature complete, you're getting close to code complete, and suddenly product marketing is like, what is this? We haven't talked about what it is that you're building. And then products like, that's not what we talked about in the PRD, or designs like, those are not the right icons, or leadership is like, this is completely opposite of what I expected you guys to do, right? It's the tiny fissures when they start to appear that you will see that, okay, something is happening, something is disrupting our collaborative nature. And a lot of people would argue with me that, oh, that's just get people into a room and tell them to collaborate better, right? And I'm like, yes, you can do that if you want to keep the scale of your organization small. But I think at some point, I find that if your engineering organization is, the right time for me is like when they've crossed a few dozen engineers. I think that's
Yeah.
the first time that you start to see fissures that
Mm.
appear. And then you can either ignore them until they become full on cracks and then eventually holes, and have a terrible event happen, which is detrimental for your organization and business. But it's things that you can avoid and have those conversations early. And the other thing I say is that, technical program management itself is an art. It's something that can be taught. If you do not want to bring on people, then you need to train your PMs and your engineers to think like technical program managers. And no, it's not all about who gets to write the Jira tickets. There's a lot of facets that are involved about what's the right level of information to have and things like that. How do you collaborate better? What is stakeholder management beyond just, well, we need a RACI chart, or we need a big matrix that tells us what our roles and
Yeah.
responsibilities are and things like that. We need meeting minutes. And that's where I'm like, the vegetables part is being replaced by AI. So it's becoming a question of, I think there's going to come a point where TPMs, the role will still stay relevant, but organizations can function a lot longer before they bring in these types of roles.
Yeah.
And you need these kinds of roles, frankly, when it's software and hardware coming together. When it's purely
Yeah.
software or purely hardware, I think you can get away without having these. But when you start to have this intersection of disciplines and focus areas, oh man, you need somebody who is constantly
Yeah.
focused on the execution part of it. And I think Tony Fadell talks about it in his book Build as well. There's like an entire section on program managers and product managers. And I know he
Yeah.
talks more about product managers, but there is an aspect of like, okay, this is why you bring in a program manager.
Yeah. I think it's a great take. So I was thinking while you were talking that this is a similar type of conversation that seemingly we have for many roles. Where the
Hmm.
tools getting better, it happens. We say all the time that we don't need managers anymore, or we need less managers. Because a lot of their job can be automated, or you can just give more ownership to engineers, and to people working on the product. And so I guess it's the same for this. For people who work at this, middleware level, that have to, fight to demonstrate the value, of what they bring all the time. And I think this can now segue nicely into your own framework, because my question would be, so how do you work, with technical program management? How should you approach problem solving in a way that is naturally different from when you didn't have them, when you had a team that was just organized around, product management in a single team, possibly.
Yeah.
And of course, with a specific angle around hardware and software work combined together, which is what a lot of your career, I think, has gone through at both Apple and Google and Humane.
Yeah, it's quite funny. I've been fortunate enough that I got my career start at Blackberry, where as like a 19-year-old PM, right? I'm shipping the BlackBerry Bold as the manufacturing project coordinator, and the title sounds very like small, but I was the only person connecting program management, hardware, software, manufacturing. I was running hardware builds, making sure that we had firmware image. I cut my teeth on operating systems in that internship for 16 months, and that has stuck with me for a very long time. I got to see how smartphones are built. I learned about SoC chips. None of what I
Wow.
was doing in undergrad, right? And I'm still 19 when I'm doing this. And then when I went to Apple, that was an education, right? So and the education itself was, I think what BlackBerry suffered from was focus. They lacked focus, they lacked style and taste, and Apple showed me what it means to be focused, and where focus comes from, and how do you enforce that focus. And this is where it starts to segue into a bit of I'm going to take a philosophical turn. I always tell everybody that you got to read the humanities. You have to read philosophy. You have to
Mm.
read psychology. Get out of the technical books. There's an entire world in humanities that can make you a well-rounded, better individual. And the most fascinating thing is that we as a species are very solution oriented. We want quick fixes. If we are encountered with a problem, we want to immediately want a solution that we can just apply, right? So when
Mm.
you start to think about your role as a technical program manager, you sit at the intersection of everybody, right?
Yeah.
You sit between engineering, you sit between product management, design, product marketing, business development, the web, the cloud infrastructure, right? So you get to see everything, pieces of everything.
Yeah.
And when you have problems, they never come in the clear shape of like, here's what the problem is. I'm sure everybody who's been there has had this conversation in a leadership position or middle management position. Your boss just comes to you as like, we need to ship things faster. Let's be more agile. I've heard about this
Yeah.
OKR thing. Let's do that. Right?
Totally.
Everybody's like, oh, I've heard about Scrum. We should do 2 week sprints. Okay, we can do 2 week
That will
sprints.
solve all of our problems. Yes.
That, magically, right? Everything is just going to feel a lot better because we did Scrum. And I'm not hating on Scrum, right? Even Safe, right? Safe is like, there's a lot of aspects of Safe which I like, but overall, it's just like, then you go hire consultants, then you go hire people who come train you, and it's like an entire industry that's available at your doorstep. But I think over time, what I've learned to do is when a problem comes to me, I take a step back. And when I take a step back, what it gives me is this out of body experience of like looking at the bigger picture. And what you have to realize that before you start suggesting solutions, you need to look at the problem through 3 lenses. And this is what I call the world builder framework.
Mm.
It's inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's just approach to how he builds films. If you've watched his films or are a fan of his films, there's this extreme sense of realism. Like somebody spent time looking at the world around them and noticed every single thing, including why does a blade of grass flow this way, why that way, what sound is supposed to be this, what shape. It's just amazing. And if you notice that a lot of Miyazaki's drawings of like grandma characters are the same. So
Yes.
there's a pattern of repetition because once you find something that works, it's very possible that you can continue using it on many, many different problems.
Yeah,
So you've got three
I mean,
lenses.
just as an aside, as a big fan of Miyazaki's work, who has literally posters of his movies hang up in the house, I can confirm this feeling totally.
It is.
So yeah,
Look at the grandma from Spirited Away, and then you look at her in all the other one, like Howl's Moving Castle and
yeah,
everything else, and you'll start to see that. Oh my God, it's the same nose, it's the same shape. I'm like, oh,
yeah.
this is insane. Um, anyways, we're digressing. I think we're going to need another hour on just Miyazaki. So you've got three lenses: environment, people, and physics. When I talk about the environment, there's two things. This is something I borrowed from Ben Horowitz's article, and I think I wrote a post about it in my newsletter as well. That I think companies operate in two sets of modes. There's wartime and there's peacetime,
Yeah.
and each of those environments calls for a different approach. When you're fighting for your life, you cannot be the person who says, "Let's do safe," or let's do OKRs, or let's do 6-week sprints or 2-week sprints, because that's how we will move faster. You need to think about reduction, simplification through reduction. What process can I remove and get people talking more so that we can make decisions faster, right?
Yeah.
If you're in
Yeah.
peacetime has a lot more flexibility. People want to take more time. People want to have discussions that are lengthy. You want to weigh the pros and cons, and you want to look at things through different lenses, right? So you're more amenable to, okay, we should do OKR. We're not under any existential threats. Let's figure out how we can experiment, right? There's more openness to experiment. There's less rigidity. And then when you look at the people lens, I have learned, and this is something I picked up from a philosopher by the name of Isaiah Berlin. He talks about hedgehogs and foxes. There's two types of personalities: the hedgehogs and the foxes. The hedgehogs believe that they have figured out the right solution, and no matter what anybody says, they're going to be laser focused on making that happen. I'm pretty sure you've come across an architect or a staff engineer who's like, listen, you don't need to think about it. This is the right solution. We need to make this
Yeah.
happen. They will go talk to the senior managers and the VPs and have side one-on-ones and be like, this is the way to do it. Don't listen to anybody else, right? This is going to make us millions. Like, we're going to be a unicorn. It's going to be great. We're going to save a lot of money, right? And then the foxes are like, no, let's write out a document. Let's weigh the pros and cons. Do we buy? Do we build? Do we do Azure? Do we do AWS? There's a lot of like options with AWS. What about GCP, right? Like, oh my God, what if we went on-prem, right? Or on-prem, like they get stuck in analysis paralysis, right? So you have to understand, what kind of people are you working with? What kind of leadership do you have? Is it the hedgehogs who are just going to latch onto that one thing, no matter how simple, straightforward, or complicated it is? And then the last lens that you look through is physics. And physics is a combination of systems. There's three types of systems that every organization operates on. There is a system of decisions, there's a system of measure, and then there's a system of work. Systems of decisions are pretty straightforward. How do you as an organization make decisions? System of measure is, how do you measure everything from product operations all the way to developer productivity, right? It's just, how do you know you're making the progress that you're making? You want to be data driven, right? That's where that comes from. And that has its own set of tiny little systems within systems of like, okay, how do you measure developer productivity, right? Do we do DORA metrics, or do we just look at burn down charts, or we use linear? So I guess they gave us a cycle chart. We just look at that, right? Jira's got 50,000 plugins. Which one do we use, right? And then the last one is like system of work. And I have a lot of thoughts on system of work, but the most common one is, how do you break down and talk about the work you need to do? And the most common framework you get is, I think, from Scrum, of like epic, user stories, tasks, bugs, and things like that. My point of view on it is very simple. It's just nested tasks within nested tasks within nested tasks, right? Issue
No
management
need
is
fancy
not
names and other stuff. Just it's nested tasks all the way down. Yeah.
It is a set of Russian dolls which you just open and open and open, or however you want to package. You want 3, you want 4, you want 5, because then you get into the problem of, okay, now I got to combine multiple epics. Is that a
Yeah.
portfolio? I don't know. Okay,
Yeah.
if it's a portfolio, then finance is going to be like, we need to attach a dollar value to it, right? So you start to get into this thing, and my philosophy is like, start simple. So the next time you run into a problem, or your manager or your senior leader comes to you and says, we need to do something, we are not working fast enough, you don't go, we shall do Scrum going forward. We need to hire a bunch of Scrum Masters. We need to hire a bunch of product owners. It's like, no. Ask yourself, what kind of environment are you operating in? What kind of people are you working with? And what
Mm.
systems am I going to change because of my recommendation of what the process needs to be to help solve whatever problem that you're looking at?
Yeah. I think this is very sensible, but at the same time, it's hard to operate under this kind of mindset for most people, because I think one of the traps that we fall into as human beings is looking at things that have worked in the past, processes, mental models, things that we have done, ourselves in first person, and think that just like they worked, in the past, they will work today. They will work in a different company. They will work in a different team. So, whenever you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, while instead your framework is more like an anti-framework, in the sense that you're saying you have to. It depends. You have to look at the environment you're in, wartime, peacetime, the type of people that work with you, hedgehogs or foxes, and the laws of physics of your company, and then different companies, different environments, different people require different ways of working to get the optimal result. Is that right?
Yeah. And this is why he has the best newsletter on Substack, because he just takes my ideas and distills
Thank
it
you,
into
sir.
something super simple. Grazie, Luca. Like, that's the best way to talk about it, right? Um, I think you said something that really like stuck out for me. It depends, right? When you look at a framework, when you look at a mindset, is this the right solution for you? And oftentimes the most sensible answer is, well, it depends. And I think what I was trying to do, and what bothered me the most, was like, there has to be a pattern to the question, it depends, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the most nebulous and non-answer that you can ever give. It's like, it depends. So I started looking back at the time I spent at Apple, and at the time I spent at Google, building and working on iPhones and iPads and Apple TVs, and shipping the first visual assistant that Google ever shipped with partnership with Lenovo. It was running a brand new operating system called Android Things. Um,
Wow.
you don't have a lot of. So not only were we building a new hardware, but we were also building a new operating system. Um, sure, it was based on Android, but it's like, it's not easy when you think about, anybody who's worked in operating system and software. You can't just strip parts out and be like, yeah, here you
Yeah.
go, it works, right? There's a lot of modification and customizations you have to make. So I always walked into roles where either processes already existed, or we leveraged them because we were part of a larger organization that we could borrow things from. And I think it wasn't until I got to my first startup, which I'm at right now, Humane. I was the first technical program manager that they hired after the head of technical program management. And my first job was to figure out, how do we establish structure at Humane, of how do we use Jira, um, how do we do sprints, how do we do planning. And I was like a kid at a candy store. I was like, what do you mean I get to decide what candies we get to buy, instead of somebody telling me, here's the package that you get and this is all you will get in that? And the other amazing thing was that suddenly my iteration cycles were a lot faster. We would try something for 3 weeks and we'd be like, yeah, it's not working. Let's try something else. We tried that for a month. It didn't work. Let's try something else. Can you imagine making like organization level changes at Apple or at Google, even within a small
Yeah.
team? It's impossible. I tried doing it at
Yeah.
Nike. I couldn't get anything done. When I became director of program management at Nike, it was just like I got more frustrated because I thought being in middle management, I'll get more chances to make changes. It's like you have less chances of making changes. Um, so the shape of this started to form, this framework or anti-framework. I like that. When I started to actually apply my learnings at Humane and figure out how do you build process from the ground up. And I finally understood the concept of it depends, because you will have people who have different personalities and different approaches. They will react differently to systems of work, to systems of,
Yeah.
decisions. And when you're operating in wartime or peacetime, the stakes are completely different. The
Mm.
openness that people have to process changes, to governance, is very different. And you cannot just use the same yardstick for
Yeah.
everything. So you're right.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why many people have become kind of skepticals of
Yeah.
frameworks. You know, a lot of the flack that Scrum or Safe get these days, I think that's because they present themselves as a one size fits all solution, and things start to look very differently if you instead consider them as guidance, and that you can take some just small pieces from and adapt them to your own reality, as opposed to a standard set of practices that you either take them in full, or you have to trash them. But truth is, as you said, you can have a framework around figuring out what depends means,
Yeah.
as opposed to a framework that is prescriptive about what to do, and this and that.
One of the other things that happens when you start looking at the world and the problems you occupy, or the problem spaces you occupy through this framework, you suddenly start to see the possibility of mixing frameworks together. I'll give you an example. When I first started at Humane, and the person who hired me at Humane, exceptional PM leader, was taught me. I thought I had finished my learning after being in the industry for 12 years, being a director, being an individual contributor, delivering a lot of crazy stuff at Apple and Google. I thought my learning was done until I came to Humane, and I was like, no, there's so much more to learn. This
I've
is
just
insane.
started.
It's like it was like being back to square one again, and I was so happy. What I saw was my boss was taking pieces of different frameworks and stitching them together into something bespoke. I was like, I didn't even know you could do that. Like, what do you mean? I can take the sprints from Scrum, I can take the program increment from this, agile thinking from this, basic PRDs from here. It was like my world just suddenly opened up to like, okay,
Yeah.
suddenly now you can start mixing systems together. But the only way you do that is you have to understand, going back to the three lenses, is like the environment, the people, the physics. It's like you need to look at the entire problem through those lenses. And then you start to see, okay, for this one tiny problem, I can borrow something from Safe. From this tiny problem, I can borrow something from extreme programming, right? We don't want to
Yes.
do weekly sprints. Great, we'll borrow Kanban, right? It's like suddenly your whole world opens up and you're not tied down to frameworks. Suddenly, every framework is possible to implement. And that's insane. That's amazing, right? And then you become like not a systems thinker. Now you're a systems philosopher of like, what can I mix today? You're like an alchemist. You're a systems alchemist now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I think that's the healthiest approach to frameworks and practices, because there are so many, and of course there are no none of this is mutually exclusive. I mean, you can and should mix and match this. So I'm wondering, in this alchemy process where you try different things, you mix them together. What is your North Star? I mean, what is your the signs that you pay attention to, that you're doing well? I mean, that you're putting things together in a way that works for the elements that you have mentioned before. So for your environment, for your people, for your physics, what is your way of looking at, your own feedback loop that things are going well by combining these things together?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot about designing products when I was at Apple. I remember the first time I went, I was part of the iOS program office. And I remember the first time I participated, I started my career at Apple with Core OS team. And then when I slowly moved up the stack to do UI features and whatnot, that was the first time I got to go to the design studio and sit with the designers, the famous human interface team at Apple, and sit
Wow.
and listen with them and talk to them and have conversations with them and work on projects with them for many number of years. And one of the principles that we had was reduction in the steps that you need to take to achieve something. And that's something that I've carried forward in all the things that I do. So when I look at a process, it's very easy to come up with something extremely complicated. But coming with something that is utilitarian and elementary is very hard. So the way I approach it and the things that I look for is that I sketch out an entire process. Don't worry about the steps. And then I start to find opportunities where I ask myself, why am I doing this? What is this step supposed to achieve? Right? Why am I asking the engineers to put this label here? Why are we spending a week doing this particular part of the process? And I know a process is working when it has the least amount of hoops that you have to go through, least amount of steps. That's for me one thing of like, how quickly can we get to an outcome? And another signal that I look for is how often is engineering bypassing the process, right? If they're bypassing the
Love that.
process, it means they found an inefficiency that I didn't think about. And I need to go and figure out what that inefficiency is. I think most people will be like, you listen to how engineers complain. I think engineers are operating under constant stress, under constant deadlines. And for them, the only outlet of relieving that pressure is complaining and to voice their complaints. And with time, you learn to understand the signal from the noise. And don't always over index when engineering is complaining about process that this is too heavy. Go talk to them and listen to them, but it's not the be all end all signal, right? But when they start bypassing it and not doing it, that's when you know something is broken. And that's when you try to go figure out what is it that you're doing? How are you bypassing my system, right? It's think about it from like a security engineering perspective, right? Hackers are there to exploit like your security systems, right? And when you find out what the exploitation is, you go learn about it and you go fix it, right? And I think technical
Yeah.
program managers, engineering leaders, and PMs, or anybody who's responsible for creating processes and frameworks and things like that, that's the one thing you look for is like, how often is my system being bypassed? And if it is
Yeah.
very often, you messed up and you need to go back to the drawing board. And you find the person who's really good at bypassing your system. And then you sit down with them and have a coffee chat and be like, why are you doing this? How do you do this? What are you hoping to achieve? And I think we kind of need to stop drawing things or process and framework from an ivory tower point of view. I think architecture has the same problem, right? The ivory tower architect, right? I think you can have the same with
Yeah.
process makers and governance enforcers, where we just build something in isolation and be like, yeah, because this is how I think about it. Treat it like a product. When I create a process, I go find a few engineers to go talk to them and be like, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I want to do. What do you think about it? Right? That's another signal for me to know if I'm on the right track or not. So to summarize, it's the number of steps. If it's too many, and sometimes you have to have too many steps because you're doing something crazy. Like you don't want to inadvertently rely on CI/CD and push something and some demo's happening somewhere and it breaks the entire demo and you're like, oh my God, what's happening? Right? Or you have a production outage, right? And the second thing is, how often is your system being bypassed? I think the moment you figure out somebody's bypassing your
Yeah.
system, you need to go talk to them and figure out what's going on.
I love this answer, and I love the strategy of going to people who are actively bypassing the systems. I think, in a way, it's similar to, the famous picture that you see of, I don't know, a park where there is the official paved path that people should walk on, and then there is, the shortcut that actually
Yeah.
everybody does because it's shorter. It's just, the trace in the middle of the grass. It's kind of the same thing. I mean, you find that some people are bypassing the system or doing things that are actually better because they're faster, and you adapt. I mean, you talk with these people and you make the process leaner and possibly do the same thing that they are doing,
Yeah.
because if they're doing it, there is a reason. So I love this advice, and I want to go back to something that you said before, that when you joined Humane, it was like going back to square one, because totally different environment, startup versus big tech. So I want to ask, how is it different? I mean, aside from maybe the obvious, less bureaucracy or less structure, what is something that, in your experience, startups like Humane get right that big tech don't? And possibly vice versa, something that you have found at Apple or Google that they really got right, that it's harder to execute
Yeah.
in startups.
I think you have to look at it from the industry, the product offering that they provide, and the services, right? Startups like Humane, and anybody that works in a hardware startup, your development cycles are a lot longer because it takes a very long time to build hardware,
Yeah.
right? Um, a single resistor change or a capacitor change or moving the PCB design slightly over completely changes the entire product versus a one line change in software, or I introduced a new method, or I introduced a new function and it's like, oh, okay, you broke the automated test, okay, I'll go fix it and it's done. It's like, no, you change hardware, you sit there for 6 weeks for the next build cycle, and then when the device comes, you're like, well, shit, I hope you go through validation, you go through tape out, you go through SMT, you go through, okay, now we put housings. Are we in EVT, DVT? Like, it's a lot more complicated, right? So we have longer
Yeah.
development cycles. I want to counter this narrative, and this is a very controversial statement. I think bureaucracy can be good. In my mind, process is designed to do two things. One, either process is meant to make things faster, or process is supposed to slow things down. And the reason we want to slow
Yeah.
things down is because we want to be more thoughtful. Maybe we're operating in a part of the stack that cannot move as fast as UI because the consequences of getting it wrong is different, right? Think about a
Mm-hmm.
bad production deployment on the cloud versus I moved the button from left to right, or I put the button up here and it's like now outside of bounds of screens. Like it's like faster iteration cycles. The thing about big tech and startup is that when you're at big tech, you have the space to think about solutions. You have the luxury of thinking about what is the right way of doing things, what is the right code pattern, what is the right design from both an architecture perspective and whatnot. Unless you're a big tech company that's fighting for its survival, aka Blackberry, versus Apple, which is a
Mm.
juggernaut and can do a lot more things. And you can be more decisive about not shipping something when it's ready. I think startup forces you to always operate in solutions mode, right?
Mm.
You cannot be that you get a request from your leadership of like, we want this feature. You'll be like, okay, it's going to take 3 months. I need X engineers. I need this design. I need it by this. I need it by then. It's like, no, what's the fastest way that we can deliver this right now and then improve upon it later? And for a lot of people, and I've started to see this, who transition from big tech, this fluid environment is very nerve wracking because you come from an environment where there is structure. Every conversation has a touch point. Every action has a set procedure that comes with it, right? But at a startup,
Yeah.
you see a problem, nobody's around you except you. So you have no choice, but you pick up with it and you run. And you run as fast as you can and you tell everybody, I got it. I got it. Right. It's like when you play baseball or football, right? Yeah, you get a ball passed to you. You don't wait around and have a discussion of like, am I the right person for this to be passed to? It's like you just freaking run with it. You run with it. You know
Yeah.
what the goalpost is. You know what the North Star is. You just run with it. And I think a lot of people who come from that structured environment into this kind of a fluid environment, they struggle. And I think that's the biggest difference between startup and big tech. It's not about 2 week sprints or 3 week sprints or agile, non agile, waterfall, not waterfall. It's the mindset that you bring to the game that's vastly different.
That's a very interesting take. I was thinking that comparing to the history with the history of I don't know, products that have been successfully released by big tech versus products from startups that have been successful, and it feels to me that as you said, startups need to optimize themselves to operate under the assumption that you win by being the first mover. I mean, but it's not black or white, but you
It's
win
not.
more by being a first mover, you know, by being the fastest one on the block rather than by being the most thoughtful one, you know, the one that gets the things the most right. While instead, if I think, for example, Apple is famous for winning with products by being the last mover sometimes, you know,
Yeah.
the last entry, which, however, gets the most things right because it had time to be more thoughtful, spend more resources on that. So, as a startup, you play the game instead to be first
Yeah.
sometimes.
I think it's starting to touch upon the concept of focus, right? I think
Yeah,
the mainstream thought is like you focus by saying yes to a few things. I remember when I was at Apple, I can't remember if it was like iOS 7 or iOS 8, that famous WWDC slide where the line was for every one yes, there was 1,000 no's. I
yeah,
printed
the
that
video, I love
screenshot
that.
out and I always had that. I had two things on my desk at Apple that I got from the marketing advertisements that Apple did. One was for every yes, we said 1,000 no's. And there was an iPad ad that came out where it was, I think, Robin Williams narrating the Dead Poets Society of like, what will your worst be? And I've always in my career asked myself of like, what's my next verse? And I had these two things painted, like I had printed them out and I always had them on my desk at Apple. Focus is a funny thing. You could imagine that a big tech company has a lot harder time focusing versus a startup. And I think it's the other way around. I think startups
Mm,
struggle more with focus versus a big tech gorilla because it's do or die for startups, right? Everything seems like the thing to do, right?
yeah,
At big tech, and particularly at Apple, and the reason why Apple is so great at what it does is that it has perfected the art of saying no. And there was this great article in the Harvard Business Review many years back um, where they talk about how uh, they were working on a new camera feature and they didn't feel ready. So they were like, it's not ready. We're going to ship it later. Apple can do that because they've got like $1 trillion in their bank account or something, right? Versus a startup, we're like, oh my God, that feature looks nice. That feature looks nice. That feature looks nice. Everything looks nice. And everything
yeah.
seems like we have to do it. We have to do it, right? And this is where I think it's harder to focus at a startup because you don't know, particularly pre-market product market
Product
fit.
market fit.
You got to throw 50,000 things at the wall to make it work.
Yes.
But I also think that big tech cannot operate like a startup. I'll give you a great example. Google's like that. Google is throw 50,000 things at the wall and see what sticks. We shipped the Android Things platform, and 4 months later, Apple killed our team. Sorry, Google killed our team, right?
Hmm.
And we got absorbed by
Yeah.
Fuchsia because that was the next ooh shiny thing. So we started building a Fuchsia operating system from the ground up. And a lot of us at Android Things were extremely frustrated because we had started selling devices, we were shipping things, we had said no enough times to figure out what worked. So it's even big tech to big tech. It's very funny. Focus is a unicorn, and very few companies have perfected the art of it. And I think Apple is probably one of the few places that has really perfected that art. So yeah.
Yeah, that's probably one of the lessons that can work for all companies. I'm sure that it's more tempting for startups to constantly operate on in the mindset of just throwing things at the wall and see what sticks, because it feels like there is less at stake. If it doesn't work, let's try another thing. But I'm not sure that startup would benefit less, from focusing more than big tech. I think that's probably one of the universal values that you can find in with digital products that uh, all companies need to learn a little bit more about.
Yeah, and I always tell people is like take whatever I say with a grain of salt because the way I've operated my entire career has been at the intersection of software and hardware.
Yeah,
I operated a thing that moves on a daily basis to something that moves on a monthly basis, right? Because hardware is extremely slow, it's very rigid, it's very regimented, and software can be just like, we're just gonna fly off the seat of our pants, right? Like
yeah,
it's like we're just gonna go. So you're absolutely right. I think software-based startups or SaaS services and things like that that are purely software can operate a lot faster. They can experiment with things because the cost of doing the next thing, the opportunity cost, is very low in many cases. What is it? If it doesn't work, we revert and then we try again, right? Versus hardware, it's like, no, you got to wait for the next build cycle. You need money. You need people. You need a lot more engineers to build things out.
yeah.
So and this is where I really love what I do at that intersection of software and hardware because it keeps me nimble. It keeps my assumptions about doing things in check, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You get to build physical
Okay.
things.
That has to be very challenging. I've never worked in an environment that combine hardware and software. So I have my brain wired in a way. I feel that it's all around experimentation. Is all around iterating very fast, validating hypotheses, and all the the startup mindset, the software startup mindset. And I wonder how many of these things still stand, when hardware comes into play. So can you really be, agile or and lean, when when you're creating a hardware product? I mean, how do you, or should you trust, your expertise, your knowledge about the product way more rather than, validating early with the customers because maybe you can't do that physically. So can you still be agile with a hardware product?
That's a great question. That's a really great question, and I think the way to think about it is that you'll never be purely agile and you'll never be purely waterfall, right?
Of course. Yeah.
I'll give you an example, and I think this is the space where hybrid waterfall and agile comes into play, right? And this is where the role of an orchestrator becomes really interesting. Think about, let's take an example of like Android or iOS, right? Every year they have new features to ship out. They're modifying the platform. Every year there's a new version of the iPhone that's coming out. And the way that hardware develops is that you go through these build gates, right? You start off with prototypes, then you go into EVT, then you go into DVT. I always mix my DVT and EVT. And then you go into PVT. And PVT is like that final stage where the hardware is coming together. And oftentimes these are months apart, right? Or weeks apart, depending on how complicated your device is. If it's just a simple Bluetooth beacon, it's not going to be as complicated as, say, an iPhone or a smartphone or a laptop or anything like that. Um, and then you get to mass production where you've made enough hardware changes that you just keep. That's when you start churning out the machinery, the manufacturing machinery, where just pumping out products. With every
Yeah.
one of these hardware gates, there is a set of requirements that the hardware and manufacturing teams have. With EVT, they're trying to validate the engineering design of the hardware. So they're looking
Yeah.
at, is this the right display part? Is this the right memory part, right? And all of these devices or components need firmware, right? So now you can imagine that software has to deliver an image to the factory, which then can be installed onto these devices so that they can test the various parts, right? So
Yeah.
that's what Core OS or the firmware teams are doing. And then on top of that, you've got UI teams who are building new features. And every time you're building new software, you're putting it onto a device, things break, right? It's natural. So what starts to happen is that you have hardware operating at a waterfall process. Software continues to operate at agile process. And the way that translate is that you have intersection points, you have milestones, right? And your first milestone is like, okay, we've got this engineering build that's coming up. Firmware, we need this from you. We need these functionalities. We need this much capability. And then the UI layers are at the bottom, iterating and moving fast and things like that. So the firmware team is like, okay, this is the milestone. This is when EVT is happening. We will do 2-week sprints to get to where we're going to that milestone, right? And along the way, they either use simulators or FPGA boards or these big prototype boards to validate that indeed the part is doing what it needs to do so that when they get to that milestone, it does what it does, right? It's doing what
Yeah.
it's supposed to do. And then the UI layer at the bottom is like using simulators, right? Xcode, like look at any IDE that you have, there tends to be simulators, right? So they're like, okay, we're going to operate on a week-to-week sprint and we're going to iterate and build. At some point, every hardware company needs to run a beta program or an internal dog food program or a living on program where the hardware is stable enough that we can start living on the device to figure out,
Yeah.
did we build the right thing? So now you see convergence points. So yeah, hardware and software products, when you have this intersection, when you're building devices, you can operate in a hybrid waterfall and agile mode. But the way you link those pieces together are these sort of touch points and checkpoints and milestones. And you need to have a clear understanding of where there is flexibility on the software side and where it needs to be rigid. You cannot be like, oh,
Hmm.
sorry, we didn't have the milestone ready. Wait until the next milestone. It's like, no, the window for hardware is closing with every gate to validate if that part is right or not, if it's operating within the thresholds, if it's operating within the spec.
Yeah.
And the more time you have to test these things early, the more easier it is to catch hardware problems. Because once you get to PVT and mass production, that's it. If you mess
Yeah.
up, global recall, right? That's the only
Yeah.
solution. Is like you recall every
Yeah.
piece of
The
hardware that you have.
nightmare.
It's a nightmare, and it's a death knell for a lot of hardware companies when you have global recall like that.
Yeah. That's so interesting, and it makes me think at regular software projects that look like toy projects compared to this.
The regular software projects have their own sort of kinks and clinks to work out, right? There's an element of user research that's involved. I remember when we were at Nike, we spent a lot of time doing user research to figure out what is the right language to communicate with our users. So what I did was one of the portfolios that I owned at Nike was data privacy. And one of the most fascinating things that I learned is that Europeans understand the concept of cookies better than the Americans because GDPR has forced them to think in that lingo.
Yeah.
I was like,
I don't know if
I didn't
I
even know
should be
that.
proud of that skill.
Right. So, and this is where I keep going back to my, like, maybe I'll figure out there's an external facing lenses for my world builder framework of like, how do we take this concept and remove it from process and governance to product building of like, there's a whole bunch of things. And every software developer knows that region by region things like the environment changes. You have to think differently. You have to approach it differently. So I don't think software is better than hardware or hardware is better than software. They both bring their own interesting things to the table. And if you can ever operate at the intersection of both, oh my God, it's so much fun. It's so much fun. It's stressful. It's extremely stressful, but it's a lot of fun.
That surely looks like a lot of fun. I mean, I would like to be like, bird on your shoulder to come to work with you and look at and all the amazing stuff that is happening at Humane. I mean, I remember the announcement. I was thinking about you, and I was thinking, oh my god, because I've known that you were working at Humane for a long time, but I didn't know what you were cooking, and then, and then I saw the announcement, I saw the AP, and I really thought, oh my god.
It's
And
it's it's
what
it's
you,
fun.
yeah,
New paradigms are always fun.
yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking, I mean, you keep mentioning and linking all your different experience at different companies together. You've joined so many great teams. So a natural question that comes to my mind is, whenever you join a new team, in a program management role, of course, what is the first thing that you do or set up or you look for? A set of key things that you think are paramount to get right in any team.
Oh man, I, my
I,
time at
I
Apple
kept the
has
best for last.
my so one thing you have to understand, Apple left such a heavy footprint on me. It's like this imprint that I've never been able to shake. And everywhere I go, I'm always finding things that I learned from Apple to do. And one of the things that I have learned, I remember the first day I showed up at Apple, I'm like 23 and I'm working with these people who've like part of the original iPhone team, MBA from
Wow.
Berkeley, an undergrad from Stanford, and here's a guy from Toronto, Canada, who's like, here, all right, I came from York University. Okay, great. The thing was, Apple is very tribal in its nature. And one of the first things they tell you, your job in the first 30 days is to have as many conversations as you possibly can with as many people as you possibly can, right? Don't worry about architectural diagrams. Don't worry about
Great
documentation.
advice.
First 30 days. And when you're at a startup, it's not 30, 60, 90. It's more like week 1, week 2, week 3, right?
Yeah.
But let's talk about it in the context of 30, 60 days. The first 30 days, your goal is to understand everything you possibly can about the people that you're working with. Because what you're finding are centers of power. You're trying to identify who are the movers and shakers within the organization, who is most respected, who can you go to in a pinch when something is broken. And this is where influencing without authority, like leadership without
Yeah.
authority, that's what we are. Technical program managers are leaders without any authority. Everywhere I've gone, the very first thing I do, my first 2 weeks, is just coffee chats with everybody. Or now it's like Zoom chats with everybody or meetup chats with
Yeah.
everybody. And I'm not asking them any sort of specific questions. It's just, I want to know who you are. How long have you been here? What have you done? What makes you tick? Right? And then slowly and steadily, once I've built the people map, then I start building the tech stack map around those people to understand, because I think you have to realize it's that the tech stack is a representation of the people who work at that company, right?
Yeah.
You want to know why the cloud deployment works the way it does? Go find the person who's responsible for it. And most probably they can tell you the historical context. If not, at least give you some idea, right? Just be extremely curious, to borrow from Ted Lasso, right? Just be curious. Learn as much as you possibly can. That's what I do. And then everything else is like on the job training, man. It'll take you like a couple of weeks to get your handle on how decisions are made, how systems work at the company you do. But it starts with people. And I think that's the one thing AI has a long way to go before it's ready to replace. It's that human to human connection. Maybe it happens when my kid's in his 20s, or maybe it happens in like 5 to 10 years, the way OpenAI and Anthropic and all these people are going with LLMs, right? Very soon we will have language action models replacing our every step.
They will spend their first 30 days having coffees and chats with AIs to learn about the company.
Maybe the first 30 days you spend conversations with ChatGPT because your company
Yes.
like absorbed all the enterprise documentation. So you're like, what kind of questions can I ask you? Like, why do we use AWS? Why not Azure? Or
Yeah.
why is deployment every 2 weeks and things like that?
Yeah.
We work in a
But
funny industry, man. It's a funny industry.
yeah. Yeah, it's a funny industry, and it's great that it keeps changing. So it keeps giving us great material for having great conversations like this one. And I love the advice anyway, and I completely agree that at the beginning it's all about the people, it's all about the conversations, figuring out the challenges, who does what, and it's really great advice. And I know that for a lot of this chat we have said, it depends. Big tech works this way, startups work that way. We have all these knobs and levers. But I think this was the perfect, parting advice to wrap up this conversation. That we are all people, and it starts with talking with each other, especially when we are learning where the problems are and when we can add value.
And look at this,
Thank
we're
you so much.
embodying it, right? You and I are having a chat. We have a chat often. For everybody who needs to know,
Yeah.
I go to Luca for all my newsletter writing advice. He's an inspiration for me, and I'm still trying to play catch up with him.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adil. Thank you so much for joining this chat. It was awesome. And thank you, everyone who joined in the audience.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.